The Jewish Religion, Its Influence Today, by Elizabeth Dilling. Chapter 7, Judaism and Paganism. The commonest statements of all Jewish authorities attribute many customs and doctrines of Judaism to Persian, Babylonian, and Assyrian sources. The leading paganisms of all the centuries have been gathered up and treasured by Pharisaic Talmudism. The long stay of Pythagoras in Babylon, his number and letter magic, the transmigration of souls out and back into the Ein Sof, procreation being the hub and center of the universe, a man's first duty being to get souls out of guff, and if this is impossible to keep on copulating in honor of the procreative powers, the selflessness of the universe, the multitude of spirits in charge of all functions, sun worship, veneration of the moon, man as a spark of the divine capable of pushing the universe with his own illuminated inflated knowing, self. All this forms the old nature religions of paganism, seeking power through abracadabra, invocations, fasting and ecstasies, to attract the spirits of the unseen world. It is as old as the Old Testament, and as current. So-called Judaism is nothing but Babylonian Talmudic Pharisaism, which at base is crass paganism, pantheistic atheism, a conglomeration of all the forms of paganism concocted through the centuries. New descriptions concocted for this very old Satanism, such as immanence, Spinoza, emanation, the Talmudic Kabbalah, and dialectical materialism, Marxism, merely dress up old pagan concepts. Title: Babylon. What the cross means to Christianity, Babylon the Great, means to the cult of Judaistic Pharisaism. Babylon was the Vatican, center, and spiritual homeland of Pharisaic Babylonian Talmudism, as Chief Rabbi Hertz has put it from 586 BC to 1040 AD, when the last of the Talmud academies moved out into Europe, Asia, and Africa from Babylonia. The glory of Babylon is referred to in the Talmud. And from Babylon to Africa, Europe, and all over the world, Pharisaism and its traditions went so that the Jew today repeats Pharisaic arguments when he studies Talmud, says Rabbi Louis Finkelstein of the Jewish Theological Seminary, one of Jewry's world top Jews. From Talmud academies in Babylon at Sira Herahadia, Nisibis, Pumbeditha, Talmudic ideas and decisions went out and were accepted by the Jews of the world. The Jewish Encyclopedia, considering the general influence of Babylonia upon European Judaism, states, quote, "The West received both the written and the oral law from Babylonia," end quote. And even after the close of the Talmudic glories of Babylon in 1040 AD, quote, "Babylonia, however, still continued to be regarded with reverence by the Jews in all part. In the 9th century, Jews of Abyssinia placed the sages of Babylon first in their prayers. A similar prayer, although it has quite lost its application, is extant today in many congregations. Rabbi Paltiel of ChiRho contributed 1,000 gold pieces to the schools of Babylonia, in accordance with a custom prevalent in all places where Jews dwelt. Toward the end of the 12th century, Benjamin of Tudela relates the Nasi of Damascus received his ordination from the academic head of Babylonia, so that this country was still predominant in the minds of the Jews of the Muslim world." End quote. Nasi, which means prince, is the head of the Sanhedrin, or ruler of temporal affairs of Jewry. The Ab Beth Din is the religious head and joint ruler with the Nasi in Pharisaism. There were 5 of these pairs before 70 AD. A Babylonian Talmud passage on Babylon exalts it as the center of religion and learning, found in Kethaboth 111a. The complete devotion to Babylon of the Pharisee Jewish religion may be seen if only by reading the Jewish Encyclopedia. Reproduced herein are 2 pages of the Jewish Encyclopedia section on Babylonia. These illustrate the proud and devoted attitude of the Pharisaism toward Babylonia, which is the glory and source of the Pharisee tradition, the Talmud. Until 1040 AD, we read the Talmud Kabbalah academies in Babylonia shown, then finally close to spread Talmudic learning to the rest of the world, moving up through Spain and across Europe. We also read that the Academy of Sura reached a point of unprecedented splendor, Pumbadia, in 1040, also passed away after an existence of 800 years. Babylonian learning should be transplanted to Europe. This forms an appropriate point at which to consider the general influence of Babylonia upon European Judaism. The West received both the written and the oral law from Babylonia. The supreme place in Judaism gave the Babylonian Talmud, and the word Babylonian used on the title page of its every volume are other indications of the Babylonian character of Judaism, so-called. The foreword to the Sonsino English translation of the Babylonian Talmud by the late Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, J. H. Hertz, is another indication. Also consider the tribute paid to Babylon in the history of the Talmud accompanying the first, 1903, English translation of the Babylonian Talmud by Rodkinson. Contrast the so-called Palestinian Talmud, which says Chief Rabbi J. H. Hertz, one of, quote, Jewry's 120 world-leading Jews, end quote, was for many centuries almost forgotten by Jewry. Its legal decisions were at no time deemed to possess validity, if opposed by the Babylonian Talmud. Title: Babylon the Symbol. Babylon is the very symbol of moral filth in the whole Old Testament, but those who call themselves people of the book exalt it in every way. Pharisaism today lives by the Babylonian calendar, keeps the Babylonian festivals and fasts of Tammuz, and enshrines its anti-biblical immorality, including sodomy and burning children to Moloch, necromancy, and other execrable practices. The Talmud cites as the word of the masters that, quote, all countries are like dough, or inferior, toward the land of Israel, and the land of Israel is like dough toward Babylon. Continuing, it says, we have a tradition that Babylon, will not witness the suffering that will precede the coming of the Messiah, end quote. A footnote states that a more correct reading of this is that the suffering, frequent in modern Christian books, is fictitious. These are the throes of Mother Zion, which is in labor to bring forth the Messiah, without metaphor, the Jewish people. Title: Talmudic Jewish months are Babylonian. The lunar Babylonian calendar was adopted by the Judaites from the time of the deportation to Babylon of the Judah kingdoms in 586 BC. Pharisaic Talmudists to this day have adopted the Babylonian calendar and the pagan names of the months, with rites to the match. These month names coincide roughly with the signs of the zodiac as follows. Nisan, a Babylonian month, corresponds with Aries. Ayar with Taurus, Siwan with Gemini, Tammuz with Cancer, Ab with Leo, Elul with Virgo, Tishrei with Libra, Hishwan with Scorpio, Kislev with Sagittarius, Tibet with Capricorn, Shabbat with Aquarius, and Adar with Pisces. Title: Judaism, Tree Worship. Tree worship, one of the oldest forms of paganism, is based on the belief that trees are inhabited by spirits of fecundity. Another of the regular Babylonian Talmudic synagogue festivals today is, quote, New Year for Trees, end quote. Its Talmudic name is Hashemasha, under which title it is listed in the Babylonian or synagogue calendar given in the American Jewish yearbooks. It fell, for example, on the 15th of Shavat, 1964, which in our calendar was January 29th. In his work, The Golden Bow, A Study in Magic and Religion, Sir James George Fraser devotes much space, even in the abridged edition, to tree worship, which he traces through different countries as a pagan observance. He says of Buddhist monks who, believing that trees have souls, quote, will not break a branch of a tree. as they will not break the arms of an innocent person. These monks are Buddhist, but Buddhist animism is not a philosophical theory. It is simply a common savage dogma incorporated by the system of an historical religion. To suppose, with Benfrey and others, that the theories of animism and transmigration current among rude peoples of Asia are derived from Buddhism is to reverse the facts." End quote. What Fraser writes about the animistic transmigration doctrines of Buddhism applies with equal force to so-called Judaism, which is poles apart from basic Bible beliefs. Looking upon the individual tree as a soul, or merely the abode of a soul, says Fraser, marks the line between animism, the simplest nature worship, and polytheism, or tribute to many gods. He says, quote, "When a tree comes to be viewed no longer as the body of the tree spirit, but simply as its abode, which it can quite at pleasure, an important advance has made in religious thought. Animism is passing into polytheism. In other words, instead of regarding each tree as a living and conscious being, man now sees in it merely a lifeless, inert mass, tenanted for a longer or shorter time by a supernatural being, who enjoys a certain right of possession or lordship over the trees, and ceasing to be a tree soul, becomes a forest god," found on page 129 and 135. End quote. The Christian reader may be perplexed at biblical excoriations against trees. The fact was that, owing to the fertility myth, individual and mass harlotry was carried on under trees, and these were planted for that purpose in groves. Two kings of Judah, Hezekiah and Josiah, were commended because they, quote, "cut down the groves," end quote, found in 2 Kings 18:4 and 23:14. God promised Moses he would bless the people he was leading into Palestine, providing they drove out the pagan abominators, the Canaanites, saying, quote, "Take heed lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare. But ye shall destroy their altars, and cut down their groves," end quote, found in Exodus 34:12-13. Quote, "Ye shall utterly destroy all the places, wherein the nations which ye shall possess served their gods, under every green tree, and ye shall burn their groves with fire," end quote, found in Deuteronomy 12:2-3 and Deuteronomy 7:5. This was in 1400 BC. Read the varying, equivocating, hedging variety of reasons given by the Jewish authorities as to why some of their holidays are celebrated. Quote, "What goes on there, or here," end quote, is the natural reaction to all this evasiveness or to direct contradictions by top sources. Under, quote, "New Year for Trees," end quote, in the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia of 1943, we are told that Shammai set this holiday for the 1st of Shabbat, around February, and Hillel, the most popular of these two first-century Pharisees, set it for the 15th of Shabbat, and of course Hillel won. The, quote, "eating of many species of fruits," end quote, is cited for this occasion, and, quote, "no special liturgy is prescribed for the day," end quote. Under, quote, "New Year for Trees," end quote, in the Jewish Encyclopedia 1905, however, we read that, quote, "it is celebrated by eating various kinds of fruits, and by a special liturgy arranged for the day," end quote. Take your choice. Then this older source cites that, quote, "the custom was to plant a cedar tree for every newborn male and a cypress tree for every female. When a marriage was about to take place, the trees were cut down and used as posts for the nuptial canopy." This is found in Gittin 57b, end quote. The Gittin 57b passage of the Jewish Talmud, referred to as the source of trees in connections with weddings, follows the Talmud Gittin 57a, a passage about Christians being in hell under boiling excrement, and every foul blasphemy of Christ. This followed by a dainty tale about David. Quote, "He went into a privy, and a snake came, and he dropped his gut from fright and died," end quote. Found on page 252, Sonsino edition. Then, getting 57b, quote, "It was the custom when a boy was born to plant a cedar tree, and when a girl was born to plant a pine tree, and when they married, the tree was cut down, and a canopy made of the branches." End quote. The article in the Jewish Encyclopedia tells how the Kabbalists, when they settled in Palestine in the 16th century, instituted the custom of eating fruits on that day instead of planting trees. Zohar and Talmud readings about fruits are also mentioned, and customs in various countries such as Russia described. There, quote, "the children are granted absence from school and join in eating the fruits," end quote. That the trees around the Canaanite altars to the procreative powers and gods were not only symbols of fertility, but were used as whoring places in their honor, is cited throughout the Old Testament. Each reformed king cut down the groves, which are denounced as a heathen abomination. Deuteronomy 12:2-3, 16 and 21, 2 Kings 18:4, 23 and 6, and 15 are typical. Jeremiah, thundering at the Judaites, accuses them thus, quote, "Under every green tree thou wanderest, playing the harlot," end quote, in Jeremiah 2:20. The post or Asherah marked the high places for sex degeneracy in the name of fruitfulness. Asherah is defined as, quote, "a wooden post or tree trunk with the branches lopped off, a seemingly indispensable part of the sanctuary in the ancient Canaanitish cult, a symbol of the fruitfulness of nature," end quote, found in the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia. Tree worship, says the same source, is the belief, quote, "that trees are inhabited by spirits who exert good or evil influences, and must therefore be revered. Such a belief existed among the ancient Canaanites, and was adopted by the invading Israelites, along with other elements of their religion and culture," end quote. Referring to the, quote, "sacred character of these trees, this corresponds to Asherah, and to what the prophets tell us of the worship upon every high hill and under every leafy tree. The Deuteronomic law prohibited the Asherah, Deuteronomy 16:21, and ordered the destruction of those already in existence, found in Deuteronomy 12:3. But tree worship was a custom difficult to eradicate, and it has survived in many parts of the world down to the present day," end quote. This is followed by the typical cover-up that has disappeared after the Babylonian exile among the Israelites. But the older source, Jewish Encyclopedia 1905, states, quote, "The extent of its worship, the tree, is indicated also by the denunciations of the prophets, a favorite phrase of theirs in describing idolatrous sex practices as upon every hill and under every green tree. As has been pointed out, the prophets were unable to completely suppress tree worship, which has survived in Palestine through all religious changes to this present day." End quote. Title: Trees Today. Since the Babylonian Talmudists acquired Palestine in 1948, formal tree planting has gone on at a feverish pace. Groves are being planted in honor of various people. President Kennedy is slated to have a grove of 50,000 trees in his honor around Jerusalem. Quote, "Tree planting to be a holiday event," end quote, headed the report. Quote, "Jewish people the world over will celebrate the new year for trees. To be Shavat, as has been the custom for many years, the Jewish National Fund will observe the holiday by planting trees in Israel." End quote. By the California Jewish Press, January 31st of 1958. In view of the millions upon millions of dollars of taxpayers' money given to Israel, it is suitable that a forest in honor of the USA government, American Freedom Forest, was proposed. It is to serve as a living monument to the friendship and close cooperation existing between the citizens and governments of the United States and Israel. Quoted from the B'nai B'rith Messenger of July 8th, 1960. Now that the anti-Christian Talmudists possess Palestine, as predicted by Scripture, There promises to be, if current reports are any indication, more groves in Palestine than Moses and the prophets ever ordered to be cut down or burned. Title: Tammuz. Each year, the old Babylonian fast of Tammuz is celebrated by Jews from the 17th of Tammuz to the 9th of Ab. The fast of Tammuz fell in 1963, for example, on July 9th, and the 9th of Ab, or July 30th. To cite again, The Golden Bow, a study in magic and religion by Sir James George Fraser, quote, "The worship of Adonis was practiced by the Semitic peoples of Babylonia and Syria, and the Greeks borrowed it from them as early as the 7th century before Christ. The true name of the deity was Tammuz. Adonais was merely the Semitic word for Lord. In the religious literature of Babylonia, Tammuz appears as the youthful spouse or lover of Ishtar, the great mother goddess, the embodiment of the reproductive energies of nature. Every year Tammuz was believed to die. Every year his divine mistress journeyed in quest of him. During her absence, the passion of love ceased to operate. Men and beasts alike forgot to reproduce their kinds. All life was threatened with extinction. His death appears to have been annually mourned by men and women about midsummer in the month named after him, the month of Tammuz." End quote. A Babylonian dirge of lament for Tammuz is quoted on pages 1179 through 1180, one line after another, starting with the words, quote, "Her lament is for reproductive proclivity is the object. Unnatural as well as sacred prostitution acts for part of the tribute to Tammuz. So intimately bound up with the goddess were the sexual functions of the whole animal kingdom, that without her presence they cannot be discharged. His death appears to have been annually mourned, to the shrill music of flutes, by men and women about midsummer in the month named after him, the month of Tammuz. The dirges were seemingly changed over the effigy of the dead god." The Golden Bow by Fraser, pages 378 through 9. End quote. Harvest time in Palestine is in the summer, not the fall. Fraser treats of the Tammuz rites in connection with the cutting of the harvest as symbolical of the wounding of the procreative god by a wild boar in one place, and the ensuring of the harvest to come by wailing over his demise. To quote him, "Nowhere apparently have these rites been more widely and solemnly celebrated than in the lands which border the eastern Mediterranean. Under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonais, Attis, the peoples of Egypt and Western Asia represented the yearly decay of life, especially of vegetable life. The supposed death and resurrection of this oriental deity, a god of many names, but of essentially one nature. We begin with Tammuz, or Adonais." End quote. Title: Female procreative goddess. Ishtar, or Astarte, writes another authority, which was the principal goddess of Mesopotamia, and perhaps the most popular deity in the Babylonian pantheon. So it was related in Nineveh, and Babylon had chosen Tammuz, son of light, to be the lover of her youth. He is wounded by a wild boar, and she goes to the netherworld in search of him. In the meantime, the world of the living is wearing mourning on account of Ishtar's death. In the absence of the goddess, the rites of love are no longer performed." End quote. This is from Man and His Gods, H.W. Smith, on page 84. This mourning and the cessation of intercourse, the whole doctrine is right here today in honor of the procreative powers to which so much adoration is devoted in the Talmud. Explanations are profuse and silly. In what is represented to Gentiles to be a monotheistic religion, there can be no reason to wail and mourn and keep a fast of Tammuz today, or was there ever, for that matter. Title: Ezekiel on Jerusalem abominations and Tammuz. Between the first and the last big deportation of Jews from Jerusalem to Babylonia from 606 to 588 BC, where the Jews were treated as colonists, Ezekiel the prophet was carried away to Babylonia. Ezekiel, who with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel is one of the four major prophets, and had been deported to Babylon with the faithless king Jehoiachin in 597 BC, in a vision of the Jerusalem temple about 594 BC, was told by an angel, quote, "Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do here." Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord were about 25 men, their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun toward the east. Then he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they filled the land with violence, and have returned to provoke me with anger. End quote. This is from Ezekiel 8:9-17 and 9:14-17. Today, celebration of the fast of Tammuz, together with sun and moon veneration, prevails the Jewish synagogue of Satan found in Revelation 2:9, just as in the time of Ezekiel. With that awareness characteristic of Talmudism, the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia cites Ezekiel's denunciation of the weepings for Tammuz, who, quote, was held to descend to the netherworld every year in the month of June or July, and then, after lamentations and various offerings, to be restored to life through the intermediation of his wife or mother Ishtar. This is a vegetation myth, very similar to that of Adonais in Syria. The share of the women in the rite was due to the fact that the myth was connected with the idea of fertility. The fourth month of Babylonian year, July through August, was named after Tammuz, and this has been taken over into the Jewish calendar. End quote. The authority for the fact of Tammuz in Judaism is Talmudic, and it is particularly observed by the Orthodox Jews. See the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia on Fasting. It is one of two main fasts of the synagogue year. The other is in connection with the high holidays, when all vows and obligations to be made during the coming year are annulled in advance through the Kol Nidre. During the 3 weeks between the 9th of Ab and the preceding fast of Tammuz, no marriages may be performed. Title: Today's Wailings for Tammuz. In the Code of Jewish Law, we find under, quote, laws concerning the interval between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Ab, in chapter 122, quote, one should not cut his hair during these days. Paring of the nails is forbidden only during the week in which the 9th of Ab occurs. Concerning the goblet of wine for Havdalah on the conclusion of the Sabbath, if there be a child who is able to drink the greater part of the goblet, it should be given to him. It is permissible to have new garments made by a non-Jewish workman, but not by an Israelite. It is a custom to call up to Matfir the rabbi, who knows how to lament. Laws concerning the 9th of Ab, all enter the synagogue and take off their boots. But one light is lit in front of the reader. Prayers are said in a low voice, with a weeping intonation, mourning-like. All should be seated on the ground. Lamentations and the special lamentations should be prolonged until close to noon. Bathing is forbidden, whether in hot or in cold water. Even to put one's finger in water is forbidden. One may wash his hands in the morning, but should be careful not to wash more than the fingers. For this is what constitutes the main morning wash, as an evil spirit rests on the fingers in the morning. End quote. Title: The Sacred Star of David. Non-Jews have been drenched with propaganda that the six-pointed Star of David is a sacred symbol of Jewry, dating from David and Solomon, in biblical times and signifying the pure monotheism of the Jewish religion. In actuality, the six-pointed star, called David's shield or Mogen David, was only adopted as a Jewish device in 1873 by the American Jewish Publication Society is not even being mentioned in rabbinical literature. However, the six-pointed star has been used for centuries for magic amulets and Kabbalistic sorcery. Title: Judaism and Star Worship. Under star worship, the Jewish Encyclopedia states, quote, "Star worship is perhaps the oldest form of idolatry practiced by the ancients. The observation of the stars in the east very clearly led the people to regard the planets and fixed stars as gods. The religion of the ancient Egyptians is known to have consisted preeminently of sun worship. Moses sternly warned the Israelites against worshiping the sun, moon, stars, and all the hosts of heaven," found in Deuteronomy 4:19 and 17:3. The Israelites fell into this kind of idolatry, and as early as the time of Amos, they had the images of Siketh and Chium, the stars of their god, found in Amos 5:26. The latter name is generally supposed to denote the planet Saturn. That the kingdom of Israel fell earlier than that of Judah is stated in 2 Kings 17:16 to have been due, among other causes, to its worshipping the host of heaven. But the kingdom of Judah, in its later period, seems to have outdone the northern kingdom, Israel, in star worship. Of Manasseh, it is related that he built altars to all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of Yahweh, and it seems it was the practice of even kings before him to appoint priests who offered sacrifices to the sun, the moon, the planets, and all the hosts of heaven. Altars for star worship were built on the roofs of houses, and horses and chariots were dedicated to the worship of the sun. This can be found in 2 Kings 21:5, 23:4-5, and 11:12. Star worship continued in Judah until the 18th year of Josiah's reign in 621 BC, when the king took measures to abolish all kinds of idolatry. But although star worship was then abolished as a public cult, it was practiced privately by individuals who worshipped the heavenly bodies and poured out libations to them on the roofs of their houses. This can be found in Zephaniah 1:5, Jeremiah 8:2, and 19:13. Jeremiah, who prophesied in the 6th year of the captivity of Jehoiakim in 591 BC, describes the worship of the sun as practiced in the court of the temple in Ezekiel 8:16. And even after the destruction of the temple, the women insisted on continuing to worship the Queen of Heaven. The ancient Hebrews, being nomads like the Arabs, favored the moon, while the Babylonians, who were an agricultural nation, preferred the sun. But as appears from Ezekiel 20:7-8, the moon worship of Israelites, even while they were still in Egypt, was combined with sun worship. Title: Stars in Talmudic Idolatry. The zodiac is, quote, an imaginary broad belt in the heavens, containing 12 constellations or signs which the sun traverses annually, end quote. And a constellation is a group or cluster of fixed stars designated by some name. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the findings of the ancient astronomer Hipparchus, 160 through 125 BC, concerning the position of the constellations in the cases of, quote, those which bore the same name, coincided approximately with the signs according to Talmudic tradition, end quote. In the case of the choice of symbolic signs, all may be traced to Assyrian mythology and influence. The Jews during the Babylonian exile adopted Assyrian names of the months and constellations. To continue this Jewish encyclopedia account, it says, quote, since each of the planets was supposed to rule a certain hour of the day, while every constellation governed a certain month of the year, the fate of an infant was predicted according to the heavenly bodies that presided over the hour and the month of its birth. The conjunction of the planets and constellations was accordingly manipulated to determine the fortunes of the person whose horoscope was thus drawn. A good planet might synchronize with a bad constellation to some extent. Both planets and constellations indicated certain characteristics in the person born at that time, and care had likewise to be taken to marry only such a mate as had been born under a harmonizing planet and constellation, since otherwise the marriage would be a failure." End quote. Supposedly, the sun enters the section called Aries about March 21st, Taurus about April 21st, Gemini about May 22nd, Cancer about June 22nd, Leo about July 23rd, Virgo about August 24th, Libra about September 24th, Scorpio about October 24th, Sagittarius about November 23rd, Capricorn about December 22nd, Aquarius about January 20th, and Pisces about February 19th. From the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, found under months, it quotes, "During the exile, the Babylonian system was adopted, the names of the months being derived from the common Babylonian calendar. Thus Tammuz is the month dedicated to the worship of the fertility spirit of that name. The male sex god, Elul, is the month when he was bewailed. Here, Elul is given as the Hebrew for whale. But this does not explain why the current code of Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, suggests lamenters, wailers for the current fast of Tammuz, which is in each yearly synagogue calendar." It goes on to give examples for each month of the year, such as Tishri, Heshvan, Kislev, Tebeth, etc. Here, two fictitious reasons for celebrating this fast are cited, followed by this admission. Quote, "Actually, the fast is a reinterpretation of a Babylonian festival. The zodiacal sign is the crab. Ab, or Ob, July through August, or the fast of Ob, with a fictitious reason, the zodiacal sign is the lion. Elul, August through September, the zodiacal sign is the Virgin." End quote. Title: Astrology and Moon Worship. Quote, "Astrology, the belief that the sun, planets, and star groups, constellations, possesses an influence over human destiny and the attempt to discover and to predict the nature of such influence. There are two main schools of interpretation. One based on the day of the year on which the individual is born, and classifying him by one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. The other deriving its conclusions from the exact time of the day at which the birth took place and making use of the horoscope, or the study of the position of the sun and the planets in various heavenly houses. Babylonia and Egypt were the centers of astrology in the ancient Orient. Hebrews shared such beliefs, the prophets believing as they did in an all-powerful God who ruled the world on the basis of just reward and punishment. They had no room for a sidereal fatalism, which made human lives helplessly subject to the influence of the heavenly bodies. Hence their repeated insistence that God was supreme over the sun, moon, and stars, and their scorn for those who attempted to predict human fate by such means." End quote. Note, here Isaiah 44:24-5, Jeremiah 10:2, and Isaiah 47:13 are quoted, the latter quotation being attributed to an imaginary Deutero-Isaiah. All scriptures with messianic prophecies, which Christ fulfilled, thus hard to explain away, are attributed to some nebulous latecomer. Continuing, quote, "The Talmudic rabbis, however, found no difficulty in reconciling the belief in astrology with the principles of Judaism." End quote. This is followed by a half column of fine print citing the Talmudic rabbinical pillars support of astrology, such as, quote, "Joshua ben Levi held that a man's character was determined by the day of the week on which he was born. Rabbah ben Joseph made the statement that a man's fate, including the number of years he would live, the children he would have, and his fortune, was determined not by his piety, but by his horoscope. Rabbi Hanina held the determining influence was the star under which one was born. Those born under Venus will be rich, and so on and so on. As a result of this widespread belief, the Hebrew term mazal, which originally meant constellation, was given the additional meaning of luck or fortune. Astrology made its way into the Kabbalah. Its sole survival is the congratulatory formula Mazal Tov, which means literally, may you have a fortunate constellation, end quote. Above quotations are from the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, under astrology. The statement in the above sentence about the current greeting of Mazal Tov being the sole survival is merely whitewash for the alien eye. 1 or 2 new moon days are actually kept monthly, and under New Moon Blessings of the Jewish Encyclopedia carries a full-page picture of a street in 1748 full of Jews out paying their respects to the moon. The text of the above article cites the custom of raising the body on the tips of the toes 3 times addressing the moon with the ancient formula, quote, as I dance toward thee, but cannot touch thee, so shall none of my evil-inclined enemies be about to touch me, end quote. Then those assembled greet one another with Shalom Aleichem, peace be to you, and say, good luck to us and to all Israel, end quote. This is found on page 44. Title: Father of Lies. In looking into the mess of paganism and criminality, which is whited over under the stolen name of Judaism, be prepared to first read one subterfuge, or one red herring after another, before truth even then shines through the cloud. Under Superstition Jewish, the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia of 1943 cites Rabbi Joshua Trachtenberg and his book Jewish Magic and Superstition as authoritative. His sketch also appeared in the 1955 Who's Who in World Jewry, with that work cited. Typically, Trachtenberg first says concerning New Moon Day rites in the synagogue that the pagan veneration of the new moon is not directly connected with the Talmudic ceremony observed today. Then he goes on to admit, quote, but certain superstitious practices have been associated with the rite, pointing to its continued occult importance in human affairs, such as addressing the moon 3 times. As I skip before you and do not reach you, so if others jump before me, may they not strike me. And then thrice bidding one's neighbor, peace be unto you. The ceremony, as well as the 3-fold repetitions, are typical of magical acts, and the belief that one who has performed the full rite need not fear death during the ensuing month. Page 256, end quote. Invoking the sun along with the moon is cited on page 201 of the Trachtenberg book. Title: Isaiah and New Moon Days. Isaiah, the saintly prophet of Christ, 760 through 698 BC, started right off in chapter 1 with his fulminations against Judah and Jerusalem. Quote, this is from Isaiah 1:4, 1:9, and 1:13 through 14. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, children that are corrupters, except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, like unto Gomorrah. Bring no more vain oblations. The new moons and Sabbaths, it is antiquity. Your new moons and your appointed feast my soul atteth. I am weary to bear them. End quote. They were given then, as their followers are now, a choice. And, quote, if ye refuse and rebel against the teachings of God, ye shall be devoured with the sword. Found on verse 20. End quote. In the Kabbalah, the Talmudists represent themselves as the divine presence, or Shekinah. And when the female Shekinah is copulating with her male, then Israel will be ruling the world. Says the Jewish Encyclopedia under moon, quote, the reason why the Jews count the days of the year by the moon is that, like the moon, which reigns both in the daytime and night, the Jews have both this world and the future one. The moon, on account of its monthly reappearance, is considered as the emblem of Israel. Therefore, the reappearance of the moon is sanctified by the recitation of benedictions, end quote. Title: Blessing of the Sun. The sun, universally, in paganism, represented the male procreative spirit, the moon, the female. The weeping for Tammuz and his powers of human and agricultural fertility was a Babylonian ceremonial. Tammuz was also called Adonis, and the female counterpart, Astarte, Mylitta, or Venus, according to location. Honoring all of these pagan idols has been incorporated into Judaism. The Babylonian Talmudic ceremony of blessing the sun, says the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1905, occurs, quote, on the first Wednesday of Nisan every 28 years. This is calculated by the calendar of Samuel Yarbinah, which allots to the solar year 365 and a quarter days, and asserts that each of the 7 planets rules over 1 hour of the day in the following sequence: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. The blessing is concluded with Alanu and Kaddish Yadam. The blessing of the sun was celebrated by the Jews in New York City in 1897 in Tompkins Square. End quote. The completion of the cycle occurred during the 20th century on April 1st, 1925, and March 18th, 1953. April 8th, 1981 is the date of the next observance. Title: Once in 28 years. Sun at point of creation this year, Talmud tells. This appeared in the California Jewish Voice on October 24th, 1952, over an article by Rabbi Samuel Rubin. A long-winded, hair-splitting article uses the old number and letter juggling to make an appearance of scholarship. Leap years of 13 months fall on Wednesday in Nisan. The rabbis add 19 and 28, making 47. Now rest your brain, you will need it. The Jewish Voice article continues, quote, our rabbis told us that this total of 47, 19 plus 28, comes from the following passage. Within the quote, it quotes, and God saw that the light was good. Ki tov. For these Hebrew words, in turn, amount to 47. Moreover, the sun has 3 names: Shemesh, Chama, Charas. If we take the last letter of these 3 names and sum them, we get 365, the number of the days within the sun year. We say the following prayer. Within the quote, the luminaries are good, which our God has created. God formed them with knowledge, understanding, and discernment. He gave them power and might to rule in the midst of this world. End of all quotations. Actually, these paganists dumbly follow the laws of gravity, with one mass of matter pulling on the other mathematical preciseness. They without any more knowledge or understanding than the dirt in your garden. I well remember an exultant Jewish press report of a sun blessing service conducted from a U.S. government airplane when the great day came. Vociferous chanting and carrying on is typical of the chastists whose Baal Shems are supposed to be experts at summoning up spirits by voodoo combinations of the Tetragrammaton, or Name of Jehovah, in skeleton YHWH, in 12, 42, 72 letter combinations known to the elect. This was described by the Brooklyn Jewish Examiner of May 1st, 1953. All of the tributes to the moon, monthly, and to the sun are specifically forbidden by the Bible. Veneration of the sun, moon, and stars is the oldest idolatry. That the ancients were condemned for the same things wrapped up in Judaism today and practiced now is seen in the Bible, such as in Deuteronomy 4:19, 2 Kings 17:16, 21:3 and 5, 2 Chronicles 33:3. The article goes on to give Bible verses for punishments for this kind of idolatry. warnings and against the punishments, and so on. It lists a whole bunch of them here if you'd like to check them out. Plus the Bible from the beginning to the end, Zephaniah on the host of heaven, and so on. Jewish encyclopedias will tell you that astrology of star worship was so well entrenched in Talmudism that only Maimonides, I think I'm pronouncing that right, of their sages ever opposed it. Other gods is veritably the middle name of the Jewish religion, based upon a non-anthropomorphic God and a pantheistic world of spirits. These are invoked virtually from the time of awakening to sleep at night. Guests are people we invite, but uninvited. We do not have to allow them to stay. The same of the dark spirits in Talmudism. Okay, that does it for chapter 7. The next chapter will be chapter 8 on demonology of the Pharisees. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next one.